Hey everybody, welcome to week 4 of BUSN 3500. So this week we're going to be covering a pretty interesting ethical framework and applying that to the global value chain. So since this one is pretty complex, I wanted to put together just a short video just to kind of hit the main points of this theory and how to actually apply it to a situation. Okay, so I have 15 slides here. I'm going to go over it kind of quick. And again, just let me know if you have any questions. I'll be happy to answer them here. So virtue ethics has actually been around for quite a long time. And by that I mean it was pioneered by the likes of Aristotle and other ancient philosophers. But in the last 15, 20 years, it's really gone through this resurgence in management thinking. So if you pop open a pop culture management textbook, okay, or do some readings in ethics or something like that, you're going to see virtue ethics mentioned. Okay, so it is a pretty popular theory right now. All right, so with virtue ethics, the original theory says that it is important to consider 4 broad areas here. One we call the adherence to virtues, the role of the community, the role of moral judgment, and emulation of moral exemplars here. We're going to go over these really quickly, but first we'll start with the adherence to virtues and why that actually matters. Well, according to Aristotle, the purpose in life was to achieve a state that he called eudaimonia, or this flourishing happiness. Okay, it's kind of like that pursuit of goodwill that we see in utilitarianism. Okay. So to him, to achieve eudaimonia, okay, we achieve that through this rational, theoretical wisdom and contemplation, okay, and then functionally through what he called practical wisdom, and then politics. Okay, so theoretical wisdom is these ideals, practical wisdom is how we actually apply them. Okay, what I mean here is that this perfect happiness, that we create, okay. Yeah, he said comes from this perfect activity, or kind of doing what we're supposed to be doing. All right, so it's kind of like a heart, how its purpose is to pump blood. Okay, and we could say that a heart that pumps blood well is doing its perfect activity. Well, to him, our perfect activity, since we are the only creatures on the planet that are capable of creating these high-level virtues like honesty and wisdom, okay, and loyalty and stuff like that. Okay, he said it was our duty, okay, to bring these about, to create these. Okay, hence our perfect activity. Okay, so achieving an excellence in that activity, okay, would achieve us or lead us to that perfect happiness. Okay, so just a little background there for you. All right. Now your article contrasts this between an agent-based approach and an action-based approach. Okay. So if we compare virtue ethics to other theories that govern behavior, okay, these traditional action-based approaches, and you're probably familiar with these in other organizations. So if you got a job someplace, typically they'd go over the codes of conduct, they'd go over the rules, and of the ethical norms of the stuff, or of the organization, standard operating procedures and whatnot. Okay, so you'd cover those. Well, here in an agent-based approach, you're not focused on restricting them. In fact, you're focused on developing these virtues, developing the skills for employees to pursue these virtues, okay, and then kind of put them on this pursuit towards it. All right. So rather than constraining, you're kind of working from the ground up. You're trying to create them into these ethical paragons that try to adhere to these virtues. Okay. So what exactly is a virtue? Right? Well, if you just take the dictionary definition of it, it's a good quality, an admirable quality, righteousness, a positive trait. Okay. In short, we see virtues as a set of desirable traits. Okay, things that we normally view as just good characteristics. Things like honesty, loyalty, courage, okay, that type of stuff. All right, but those are kind of the classic virtues. Right, but we can also have virtues relating to business or our professional careers. Okay, things like transparency, okay, or diligence, competence, okay, things like that. So they're not just limited to these other societal virtues. Okay, so And we ask ourselves, are they universal or are they socially constructed? And there are some virtues that are pretty universal that we find in most cultures, things like honesty and things like that. But a lot of times, what we consider virtuous is based upon the cultural context or the temporal context, meaning, kind of what era we're in, things like that. So we'll see that what behavior was considered virtuous, has changed over the years. All right. So, for example, look at this. Okay, virtues like chastity, okay, or obedience to a husband, maybe obedience to a manager. Okay, some of these virtues might have been very important, okay, to society, something like that. 100, 200 years ago, okay, centuries ago, something like that, or obedience to a manager, maybe even 40 or 50 years ago, just unquestioning behavior in the workplace is considered virtuous. But now we might not see that as, so so heavily required. Okay, maybe we'd value our own independent thinking more than just blind obedience to a manager or something like that. Okay, and if we look at the code of chivalry, kind of in classic medieval writings, okay, the code of chivalry supposedly was a set of virtue. I mean, it governed behavior of the order of knights. Right? So we look at some of the virtues here: believe the church's teachings and observes all the church's directions. Defend the church. Respect and defend weaknesses. Love your country. Show no mercy to the infidel. Do not hesitate to make war on them. Perform all your feudal duties as long as they do not conflict with the laws of God. Never lie or go back on one's word. Be generous to everyone, always and everywhere. Be right and good against evil and injustice. Okay? So some of these, really have stood the test of time. Some of these might not be as applicable to society today. All right? So the main point here is that what we consider virtuous changes. It changes, and it's also based upon a cultural context. Okay? So that's what makes this theory kind of flexible, because not only are you considering, your culture, what kind of a situation that you're in, okay, such as what organization you're working for, things like that. Because if you work in different industries, they might value different virtues. Okay, they might place importance on different virtues. So, for example, if you work in accountancy, okay, maybe a transparency, okay, would be a good virtue, or the number one virtue. Or if you worked maybe as a nurse or in healthcare or something like that, maybe they really value compassion as a virtue, things like that. All right. So, what we see here, rather than being universal, virtue ethics becomes contextual to a given person and situation. All right, now, as far as number 2 on that big list, the role of the community. Okay, so, Aristotle said that the community itself it's just an integral part in achieving eudaimonia. Okay, it's kind of like building a proper infrastructure in order to create or allow virtues to flourish. Okay, and what this is saying is that we are not developed in isolation. Okay? We are influenced by the people around us, our friends, our family, things that we're associated with, our hobbies, our interests, and other parts of the community. All right? And so therefore, it's our duty as members of these community to help other people to achieve these virtues. And it's the same thing in business. Okay? We look at business as a community, right? And say that they should support and nurture individuals within the context of their mission, okay, such as producing quality goods, services for profit. All right. So then we kind of ask ourselves, what happens when virtues conflict? Okay, what happens when we're in a situation where we should be adhering to virtues? Okay. So I have an example here. Let's say we got a person, Clarence Blunderhill, oversees the retirement fund for her company. Okay, this retirement fund manager recently quit. She needs to hire a new person to fill this position. Okay, 2 options. One is a professional fund management firm. This firm has shown consistent performance over the last few quarters. And then we got Bill as the other option. Bill's a professional fund manager that Clarence met at a conference. Over the last year, they've developed a close professional relationship and worked together effectively. Bill's not been as good overall as the other firm, but his numbers for the last quarter have been the best of the 2. So what do you think Clarence should do? And feel free to pause the video really quick and think about it. So in this situation, we have 2 virtues that are potentially conflicting here. Okay, so one, Clarence has a fiduciary duty to her company. She, by virtue of her position as the retirement fund manager, it is her professional duty to do what's best for the retirement fund. But at the same time, we also have this virtue of loyalty to Bill, because they've developed this professional relationship. Okay, but like the virtueness of their virtuosity of their relationship, I should say. Okay. So in this case, we would have to basically decide between the two. Okay? But how do we decide between the two? All right. Well, in this case, Aristotle says that a virtue is sandwiched between two vices of the extremes. Okay? And we have the vice of excess, okay, where we express too much of that virtue, and the vice of deficiency, where we express too little of that deficiency. All right. So let's say we have the virtue of honesty. Okay? Well, the vice of excess of honesty, we already know. Okay? We even have a term for it. It's called being brutally honest. Okay? That classic example. Do these pants make me look fat? Okay? Maybe you don't want to be completely honest in this type of situation, right? Or, if you have the vice of deficiency in honesty, you're basically a liar. Okay? Or the virtue of courage, okay? The vice of excess. In this case, you're probably foolhardy. You're not cautious enough. You're too rash. Okay? You don't express a lot of caution, and that could be a problem. All right? But you have a vice of deficiency. Okay? You're acting cowardly. All right? So going back to our example here, sure, Clarence might have to consider that virtue of loyalty. Okay? But in this case, if she did so, it would probably be a vice of excess. Too much loyalty to Bill, because they've only had a short professional working relationship, and really her duty is to the company. So in this case, she should really choose, okay, that to follow the retirement, or the best recommendation for the retirement fund, which is to hire the fund management firm. Okay, thus we balance these virtues. Okay, Aristotle called the process phronesis, right, or practical wisdom. And how we gain practical wisdom really is just through experience, through practice, through our own trials and challenges that we experience in life. In some cases, you might find that the virtue ethics test is inconclusive. So usually we rely on the outcomes of other tests, such as Kantian deontology, or that generalization test, and utilitarianism. All right. And then finally, we have the role of moral exemplars here. So virtue ethics states that not only should we create this community, adhere to virtues, but then we should also provide examples or individuals as examples of virtuous conduct, okay? These paragons of virtue. Right? And we do this a lot in pop culture. So, for example, if you ever watched a Disney movie or a heroic epic or something like that, we have these character archetypes of these infallible heroes that are loyal, or possess this inner strength that almost seem inhuman, things like that. Okay? So people, stories, actions, often idealized, that are used to communicate desirable virtues. All right, so in the case of this week, questions to ask: what virtues should this corporation be striving to embody? Think about these professional virtues, rather than just honesty, integrity, stuff like that. Okay, so in this case, or this week, we're looking at a company like Starbucks that sources products through the fair trade system. So, according to virtue ethics, do you think there is a virtue that they should be striving to embody that necessitates them to use the fair trade system? Okay? So you could argue that yes, they have a duty. It is virtuous for them to consider the role of their suppliers when they're sourcing their products. Or you could say, well, they have a duty to the shareholders. They have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders. That's a virtuous behavior that they should be pursuing, and they should be focusing on that rather than giving that up for pursuit of fair trade. Okay? So we talk about the virtues themselves, and then we ask ourselves, once we've come up with the virtues that an organization should be pursuing, we ask, does this action move us closer to expressing these virtues? Okay? If we are an organization that should be expressing, forethought or clarity, okay, or empathy, does fair trade move us closer towards expressing these virtues? And in the case of when these multiple virtues conflict, is there a resolution that should be achieved? Right? So just some questions to ask when you are applying it this week. Well, I'd love to hear your thoughts on fair trade and virtue ethics. So very much looking forward to reading your responses. All right, good luck. Let me know if you have any questions.